This is Rei Inamoto's podcast, The Creative Mindset. Hi everyone, welcome to The Creative Mindset, a podcast about what the future holds at the intersection of creativity and technology. I am Rei Inamoto, the founding partner of I&Co, a global innovation firm based in New York and Tokyo. In today's episode, we speak with Darren Wesley Martin Jr. and Dr. Rubina Malik. Darren is the president and CEO of Bold Culture, a multicultural communication firm that provides inclusive talent management and consumer marketing research, insights, and consulting to media, marketing, advertising, and technology practitioners. Dr. Malik is a global learning and development expert with over 20 years of experience in academia, consulting, and professional services. Dr. Malik works as a senior strategist at Bold Culture. I met Darren about a year and a half ago when my firm I&Co hired his firm to be a DE&I consultant on a project we were working on at the time. Part one of this conversation is about really understanding the nuances of diversity, equity, inclusion, and as Dr. Malik added, belonging. They share some simple yet profound tips on how to create an equitable and inclusive work environment. We recorded this conversation a couple of months ago, and it was before the Supreme Court in the United States struck down affirmative action. Re-listening to this conversation with Darren and Dr. Malik after affirmative action changed weighed somewhat heavily on my mind, and it gave me a lot to think about, particularly in the US and as a parent whose kids will be eventually going to college in a different cultural and legal environment than I did 25 years ago. Just tastes and means very different than what I imagined. So this episode, especially if you are living in the US, I think has a lot to teach us about the work and personal lives that we lead, and hope you take away something from it. So let's get started. I'm going to start with the very basics of the definition of DEI. And I'm going to start with you, Darren, and then I'm going to switch over to Dr. Malik to see if you can also help us understand, and particularly for the Japanese audience who might not be so familiar with just the concept of DEI. So Darren, first, again, this is a very basic definition, but I just want to make sure that we have that right. But how would you define DEI in the context of what you do and in the context of today's society? And I guess with the American society first, just because that's where we are based right now.
And to your question on what diversity is, I always think of it as diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? They are all four different things. Diversity is the different people that you have in the room. Equity is the equal opportunities that they have. Inclusion is, are we bringing and letting people, are they at the table, as we say, right? Do they have a particular voice there? And belonging is, do they feel like they are safe in our organization? Do they feel as if they are safe in just this world, right? And I think that we're talking more internally now, but all of our work is across those four areas: diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because equity, inclusion, and belonging, as our partners at VMLY&R would say, creates diversity, right? The way that we focus on increasing equity and inclusion and belonging creates and sustains diversity. So that's my definition.
Dr. Malik, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, I validate what Darren says, and just to put it in layman terms, diversity is, the people that you invite to a party, right? Like, so you invite the different people to the party, and then just because they're invited to the party, the question is, do they feel comfortable? Are they being asked to dance? Are they, being invited to dance, or did you invite them to sit down at the table with you to make decisions? So, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is that's like a scenario or an analogy. You can invite somebody to the dance. That's one thing. But then did you ask them to dance? Are you making sure other people might be asking them to dance and, making sure that they're having a good time? Same thing, you're inviting them to the table, and, are you giving them the food? Or is it just that they're just sitting in a chair, or are they being included in the meal? So I think it's very important that organizations not only have diverse, employees and their organization, but also making them feel like they belong, making sure that there's equity, that everybody's treated fairly, as well as that, there's inclusivity, that you're keeping anyway. Like, so for right now, it's Ramadan for me, and that's a big thing. So like, like Darren and I are doing work together. He makes sure that I'm included in the work, right? Like, oh, she's fasting, she has to break her fast, or, it's this, how do I make sure she feels inclusive and she feels belonged? Like he sent, the note to you, like, hey, just want to let you know. And that was making sure that I was included and felt belonged. So it's more than a conversation, and we may get into this more, but DEI and B it's more than a conversation. It's actually action.
Thanks for your take and definition on these terms. But one term that I actually wanted to dig in deeper is this concept of equity. And I have to say, and I have to openly admit that even though I knew the term equity for a long, long time, and I had heard it in the context of these types of conversations, really the enthusiasm about the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, and now belonging that you mentioned, Darren, is more intensified in the last few years. And again, for our audience in the US, this is an obvious inflection point that happened in the summer of 2020 when there was the murder of George Floyd. And, days following that was the beginning of a massive movement. I mean, the movement of Black Lives Matter had been happening, but I feel like that was a clear inflection. There were other smaller inflection points, but that really sort of tipped the scale. And from that summer, for many, many weeks, if not several months, and, me living in New York, I saw many, many marches of all different races and all different colors and different types of people going out on the streets to protest for people's rights and quote unquote equality. But tell us how you define equality versus equity, and how should we understand the differences between the two? And my understanding, which may be correct or incorrect, it's one thing to have equality, but it's really equity that makes a difference in people's lives. And, tell me if I'm right or wrong, or help us understand the concept of equity. Yeah.
And it says, while equality assumes that all people should be treated the same, equity takes into the consideration a person's unique circumstances, right? So everybody can be treated the same, but Black people or queer people or Asian people, right? Or anybody who's outside of the norm, right? Do not have the same steps it takes to get to what is our ideological equality, right? And many times when we look at equality, we all have the same opportunities, but do we? Right? We all can get ahead, but can we? Right? If we don't assess the barriers to entry, the barriers to staying in certain positions, the barriers to access to capital in other ways, if we go more outward, that is what we're talking about with equity. So we need to create policies, practices, procedures that ensure that underrepresented groups have a chance to meet, right, to get to the same level. But equity says we need to know what those challenges are, and we need to solve for that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Dr. Malik, do you think you could perhaps give a couple of examples of how equity works in a positive way, either in the corporate world or in the educational world? And I have some examples that come to my mind, but I would love to hear from you again, just to paint a clear picture of what that means.
So talking about pictures, there's this if you equity picture, you see the picture of there's maybe a 5'10" person who doesn't need a box. And then there's a 5'8" person who needs a little bit of a box to look over the fence. And then there's the very small person who needs a big box to be able to look over to the fence. And that is such a beautiful representation of what equity is. So equity could look like looking at someone's socioeconomic and background and maybe understanding that, you know what, maybe they need a little bit more training. Like if we're training everybody, maybe person X needs a little bit more training because they didn't just because of their background, or they don't have something that's going to help them, so we can put them all on the same level. So, you know, sometimes I feel like what we do is we kind of like do it's a one size fits all, and you know, equity isn't necessarily that one size fits all. We might need to modify it. Each one of us on this podcast, you know, we learn and we need to hear things differently. You know, you may be in writing or maybe visual or maybe auditory. So how do we make sure everyone gets what they need? That's equity. As well as, you know, creating those opportunities evenly throughout for each person. So making sure that I get the same opportunity that Darren has and, you know, you all have.
So back to you, Darren, you know, in your practice, since your firm, Bold Culture, again, you know, my firm and your firm have worked together on a couple of projects, but say outside of those projects that we worked on, and an example or two that you could mention about how you helped another company to be able to provide better type of equity for whatever, say, like in your firm's expertise, providing consulting advisory help to, say, marketing and communication executions, right? So give us a few tangible examples.
One of the things that we see, both in creativity and the distribution of that from a media perspective, is that audiences are still underrepresented from a model or even a crew perspective. And then they're also, of course, underrepresented from a media distribution partner perspective. In the US specifically, a little over 5% of all media dollars are spent on Black, Latina, Asian, LGBTQIA media combined, right? 5% is shared across all of these large minority offices. And so what we think about when working with our clients is assessing what barriers those minority media companies may have to working with these larger media agencies or even creative agencies, right? It's the same thing as far as the producers or photographers or even makeup artists and stylists who are not getting the proper representation, but also to Dr. Malik's point, both training, but also support, right? There's no support. There are no systems in place to say, hey, let's work with you. Even if they cross the barrier of being represented, if that makes sense. And so what we do at Bold Culture is assess that. For the creative side, we're looking at, you know, not only what can the creative tell in a story, or how can people perceive the story to storytelling itself, which is what we work together on, but also who's creating the content, right? And if it's about a certain community, then what we normally see is that agencies don't necessarily work with a large portion of the community they're creating content for. So we look at who's creating that content, how are they paid, right? What's the equity there? What's the challenges of getting paid? There are a lot of diverse influencers who definitely cannot chase the net 90, net 120s, net 360s that these companies are putting out, right? And so what I've seen in certain clients is that they are reducing that barrier by allowing you to kind of do like a 0.5% or 1% discount, right? To get your money up front. Like those are ways, of course, that you can ensure equity, because if we're thinking about equity, we're talking about dollars here on the business end, right? And that's one of the larger barriers to doing this work at a corporate level for minority businesses, either media or creative, right? It's actually waiting on the money, being able to, you know, support oneself until that net 90, 120, 360 comes. So with clients being able to use things, I think it's called C2FO. C2FO is one of the platforms there where you're able to work with any vendor and pay them early, right? And get a minimal discount, but it's helpful to that small business. That's one thing we've seen. We've also seen, you know, of course, assessing the types of influencers or media companies you're working with again, and how much money that you've put in on into the table versus, let's say, larger white media companies that have gotten millions or if not billions from the advertising industry, right? And so it looks different in different ways, depending on where we are, if we're at like the internal level or external level. But I would say it's all about, again, assessing the people, process, and procedures across any portion of the creative and media world. I want to
pick one of the things that you just said to talk about. Another topic that I wanted to talk with you, both of you, about was DEI in the corporate space, and how, especially since, say, 2020, that topic became a hot topic that every company, especially in America, had to do and say something about. And it's interesting what you said about the DEI backlash that is happening now in this year as well. So in the last couple of years, and again, me working with many corporations, global corporations, American corporations, and Japanese corporations, I have noticed a very noticeable uptick since 2020 with companies talking, or at least promoting that DEI is an important topic in their environment. But I question how many of those companies were really sincere about that. So, because you just mentioned about the DEI backlash that you're seeing, can you talk a little bit about, what are the specific backlash examples that you're seeing and why that is?
Yeah, so it's quite a few reasons. We love saying that there's aspiration and then infrastructure. So a lot of these companies got more aspiration. They aspired to do better, right? They aspired, and they needed to, right? Because consumers were pushing, wanting inclusion, equity across all business facets, right? And in the corporate sense, a larger corporate world across industries, DE&I is not a new thing, right? They've always had diversity officers, especially on the corporate side, less so on the agency side. There's always been people like consultants doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right, for corporations. What has changed in 2020 versus what really the difference of 2020 is that we couldn't ignore it. We were in a once in a lifetime era with the pandemic, still are, right? So everybody could see it. Everyone were talking about what's the solutions. It's hyper visible now with social media where people can keep individuals accountable. And so there are so many different advances that helped 2020 get or us get to a place in 2020 where we could hold companies even more accountable, and they had to push even more money. One last thing is that it was driven by social media, right? Because all you heard was open your purse. That was a big thing as far as like, what can companies do after, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and stuff. And people were saying, open your purse, invest in companies. And so that's what you saw, right? Because the PR companies who had to deal with this, who had to deal with corporation responses to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, had to do social listening to see what people were saying. And because the collective voice was invest more, do more, we started seeing that. Now we're in a different state. It's 3 years later, right? People may have felt like they've done enough, or people are doing some really internal work and not talking about it. So it's two different things. Some people are pulling back because we're in a macroeconomic, I'd say uncertainty, as they say. But also you have people who did take heed to saying we need to do some really deep work, and they're doing that. And those are some of our clients, right? But I think that they could do a better job with saying what they're doing instead of retreating back into just themselves. So yeah, there are certain people that are still doing it and maybe retreating into themselves. There are certain other people who are just putting it down. But that's just a historical kind of movement. Like, this isn't new. I think it's just the advances have helped us expand even more.
There's certain obvious and very tangible actions companies can do to make the workplace more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive. say, pay is one thing. That's a very clear metric. Is everybody getting the fair compensation across the board? And, is there any gap between compensation? That's one of the tangible things. Another thing that I can think about is like the balance of different types of people in the organization, right? What are some specific actions that companies can take to make the workplace more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive?
Yeah, I think that maybe then we could keep in the recruiting, conversation. I think that's the biggest one. Not requiring, a degree. And what we mean by that is, I think more tangibly, you could assess for competencies, right? You could assess for values. And that's one thing that we teach in our Rethinking Hiring course, is we really debunk all of the, myths that we hear around people not being able to hire diverse talent. And one of them is that they have not come from a great program. And maybe it's not even Ivy League, but a great portfolio school, right? In the advertising world. And the question is, well, do they fit within the competencies that we have for the role? And the competencies can be both technical and also values based, so that you understand if they're a culture fit, but if they connect to the values of the company, right? Are they, a self-starter? Are they always, wanting to be, are they teachable, I should say, right? Do they want to learn and is an always on learner in that case? Like, these are actual things that you can do to assess individuals. Of course, on the technical side, it's can they do the role? If it's graphic design, that's where you're working with the actual hiring manager to talk about the technical competencies they need. But I think that's one of the larger replacements for, one, how do we stop hiring people from different Ivy League institutions, but also implementing a hiring board or committee, which can be of 2 or 3 people, can actually also reduce the chance for bias within hiring too. So now you have a rubric with competencies that you're using, and you're using multiple people in order to talk to this individual, right? Because if we only have one person assessing them, even to get to the next phase of the process, then we innately is going to be a chance for bias, right? Because we all hold them. So having a panel allows us to talk to each other, call each other out about the biases that we may have, and then choose the best candidate.
That was part 1 of my conversation with Darren Wesley Martin Jr. and Dr. Rubina Malik of Bold Culture. There were 3 key takeaways from this conversation that I would like to share with you. Takeaway number 1, diversity is not always visible. Takeaway number 2, don't just invite them to the party, ask them to dance. And number 3, calling out versus calling in. First point, diversity is not always visible is somewhat of an obvious point, but when Darren talked about the flavors of diversity, it's not just about racial and ethnic background, but it could be socioeconomic backgrounds and other cultural backgrounds that might not be immediately visible on the surface. One of the tips and actions that they shared, and they talked about the importance of, it's not just about having the conversations with various people, but it's also turning those conversations into actions. And the thing that we need to be aware of, and particularly in the corporate and professional environment, is what type of people we hire. There's obviously, before you start working, you go through different stages of education. And as I mentioned in the beginning, affirmative action is going to have a profound impact on the future that we'll be living in. But also beyond that, as individual professionals and managers, the type of environment that we want to create can make, even small actions can make a big difference. So for instance, especially for those of us who might be in the position to hire people, it has been somewhat natural and somewhat accepted that we look at not people's working background, but also academic background, and make a decision even before we meet the candidates. And as natural as it might be to use, say, the academic background as one of the filters to make a decision, we also need to be aware of, again, especially in the post-affirmative action era, the impact of education and the lack of access to education can have a very meaningful and very profound influence on the future of somebody who is going through different types of path than we might have gone through. And those things are not immediately visible on the surface, and we need to be paying attention, again, especially after the post-affirmative action era. So number one, diversity is not always visible. Takeaway number two, don't just invite them to the party, ask them to dance. This was a comment that Dr. Malik mentioned, and I have to say that until she brought it up, I don't think I ever thought about it this way. We may think that just because you invite them to a party, you may feel that you've done your job or we've done our job to be inclusive and even be equitable. But again, in order to be equitable, inviting them just to the party may not be enough, but to be truly equitable and to show and demonstrate equity, that we need to ask in different types of people to dance with us. So key takeaway number two, don't just invite them to the party, ask them to dance. I thought this was a really apt and poignant metaphor that I hadn't heard before, and it was a really good lesson for me. Takeaway number three, calling out versus calling in. This is an extension of number two, but they went deeper into educating people around us, especially those of us who are in the minority group. I'm Japanese by birth, and I belong to the Asian American community in the US. And we might, whether you are Asian, Black, Latino, gay, lesbian, disabled, different types of minority that we might belong to, and just because we might not be part of the norm, so to speak, we might not think that it's good to call people out. And the tip that both Dr. Malik and Darren gave me was that, you know what, calling out is one thing. We can make people aware of the biases that they have, but it might be more effective we quote unquote call them in, meaning that ask them if they said something hurtful or if they said something offensive. They might be coming from a certain bias that they might be aware of or might not be aware of, and ask them to inquire within, call them into search within themselves why they made those hurtful comments, even if they didn't mean them. And especially if they didn't mean them, it's important to, instead of calling them out, it might be more effective to call them in and ask them to look within themselves and see what caused them to say hurtful things, especially if they didn't intend to. So just to summarize, the takeaways from my conversation with Darren and Dr. Rubina Malik of Bold Culture. Key takeaway number one, diversity is not always visible. Number two, don't just invite them to the party, ask them to dance. And number three, calling out versus calling in. This was part one of my conversation with Darren Wesley Martin Jr. and Dr. Rubina Malik of Bold Culture. In part two, we go into the specifics of DE&I, or as Dr. Malik mentioned, DEI and B, belonging in the communication industry. So stay tuned. I am Rei Inamoto, and this is the Creative Mindset. See you next time.